I'm going to say something that might sound extreme, but if you stay with me, you'll understand why it's true. Everything is connected to race. That is the opening of Dr. Jace Ji-sun Kim's recently published book, When God Became White. And that is how I open my sermon today. This is going to be a little bit longer than my typical sermons, but we trust each other, so just stay with me. What I hope to share with you is why Jesus cannot be white. First, we'll look at the difference between whiteness and Europeanness, and then we'll turn to the power dynamics that are part of race relations. And then we'll bring in some lessons from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And finally, we'll wrap up with lessons gleaned from today's reading from Paul's letter to the Philippians. So let me clear up what I mean as the difference between white and European. Now, European simply means from Europe, okay? I think we can agree on that. Europe has some 4 countries, the exact number differing depending on how you define what Europe is. But the idea is that European is European. White is not the same. White relates to race. And because it's a color word, it also relates to skin color. Let me state the obvious. People do not have white skin. Okay? They may have a light beige, but it's not white. You know what I mean? So really what people are referring to when they say white is light-colored skin. In the same way, people with the darkest skin tones may approach the color black, but it's not black. So it's easy to see, just like so many things we encounter, we do not have a skin tone binary, meaning there's just 2 colors, white and black. What we're talking about is a spectrum, and in this case, various colors of skin across many different cultures and places and peoples. So if there really are 2 choices, white or black, where does white end and black begin? You see, this is one of the problems of the idea of race as we know it. One of the problems that has constantly bumped up against the idea of race as skin color. Because if there really were just 2 skin colors, it would be so easy to see. But we've always recognized that there's almost an infinite amount of gradations along the many different variations of skin tones. And because we have to constantly negotiate where white ends and some so-called other race begins, there have been problems, especially in our country, where so many different kinds of Europeans have migrated in different waves over the years. You see, the people who formed the government of the United States of America were almost all English or descended from England, a place that has historically produced people with very light skin tones. They had no problem seeing themselves as white, and you too might think this is a no-brainer. But yet, when people started coming to these shores from places as close to England as Ireland, the next island over, Irish people were not automatically seen as white. And other Europeans, like Italians, were treated the same way. You see, because whiteness was not then and is not now purely related to skin tone. No. Rather, whiteness has to do with who has power and who gets to define the narrative in this country. So for many Europeans coming to these shores, part of the goal was to assimilate, to learn English, to minimize their own cultural heritage. But why? Some would say, well, that's just how you become American. And they may not realize it, but part of the goal was also to become white. In other words, they would gain political power by lumping themselves in with the dominant American culture, which has descended first from England and then expanded somewhat reluctantly, to include other Europeans. Their actual skin tone didn't matter so much as their willingness to play along and not disrupt the will of those in power. And you see, this kind of system works as long as your skin tone is light enough, because you can only stretch white so far. People of color can work within the power structures all they want, but they'll never be classified as white, because that's a power label that's also a color word. So there's one of the central conundrums of our system. Our system is set up to give a privilege to people who are white, and there's no doubt about that. So, of course, I will say, that doesn't mean life is easy for all white people. It does mean that life isn't harder because white people are white. That's a well-accepted statement. But those who like the current power structure do whatever they can to discredit it. When we can define and show proof that the systemic injustices exist, when we come up with robust academic frameworks like critical race theory, or when we try to fix the injustices through programs like affirmative action or diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, some people just cannot stand that. They howl. And if you find yourself shaking your head at me, it could be because the people who benefit from the power structure of whiteness have convinced you that there's nothing wrong with the system. So let's look at how all of this has to do with Jesus. You may be familiar with the famous portrait of Jesus entitled Head of Christ, painted by Warner Sallman in 1940. It's been reproduced billions of times. Picture, what does Jesus look like in your head? Does he look like this? This is that portrait that I am talking about. I found this beat-up copy of Head of Christ as I was going through the church archives the other day. Now, that image is a European-looking Jesus, if I ever saw one. We all know, though, Jesus wasn't from Europe, right? Right. He was from the Middle East. So is there a problem with portraying Jesus as European? Well, you might not be surprised to find that my answer is yes, there is a problem. But perhaps not for the reasons you might expect. So let me explain. See, I actually don't have a problem with the portrayal of Jesus as European in one sense. And that's because I see the value of Jesus being portrayed in a number of different visual ways across different cultures so that each people can see him in a way that relates to them, because I think that is part of what Jesus came to do, is to relate to us. And so that is a good aim. But yet, what can be a European-looking Jesus in our culture is also seen as a white Jesus. And now that you know how whiteness and Europeanness are not really the same thing, Jesus being portrayed as European gets all problematically linked up, not so much in skin tone, but in power structures. And when you start to notice that, you see what the problem is. Because you see too many, many people in the world, they look at portraits like this one and think, well, that's what Jesus looks like. And we lose sight of the fact that all that is one artist's portrayal of a Jesus that is part of his own culture. And then what we forget is that Jesus, especially that particular one, has come to be a universal symbol of Jesus as a white European. And this is reinforced because white missionaries to places all around the globe have themselves reinforced this idea, whether they understood how toxic it was or not, that Jesus, and therefore God, is white. That the missionaries' ideas about the divine, which are European ideas, are white and therefore right. And that other cultures' views are wrong. Don't you see how messed up that is? This work has been going on for so many centuries that to many people, Jesus, the poor, manual laborer, Middle Eastern man, is a nice-looking, well-groomed white European in their minds. And I bring this up on Martin Luther King Sunday because he looms large among our 20th century saints as one who could speak with the authority of a scholar, the heart of a pastor, and the fire of a prophet. And he knew how to speak to the dry and decaying bones of the American dream, the hopes of the Declaration of Independence, to see if maybe it could still live. We, of course, in the church, value speaking about political matters. It's one reason why this pulpit in which I stand is positioned between the cross and the flag. Now, Dr. King was a minister, of course. He was someone who took his learning from the academy and his leadership of the church out into the streets. He was what we would call a public theologian or an activist, and he is widely admired. Now, of course, we have this federal holiday for him. But as his daughter Bernice King reminded her social media following just this week, he was among the most hated men in the country, in his final years especially. Hated! Because he sought to disrupt the power structures of the day and cause people to see the ugly underbelly of our political reality, live and in color. I reflect on Dr. King more and more as I'm only 1 year younger than he was when he was assassinated. In the USA, we don't lynch by crucifixion as they did 2,000 years ago. We do the easier, more cowardly thing and prefer to kill another by driving nails into the flesh, not with a manual hammer, but with the automatic hammer, that is the trigger of a gun pulled from a comfortable distance. Dr. King was martyred for his faith, as was Jesus. That was a faith that coupled words and actions in a way that upset the empowered people, that is, white people. We are witnessing in our current national politics the dying grip that the white majority still keeps our country in its stranglehold. And they would prefer to squeeze out every last drop of white power that they can, no matter who is suffocated in the process. And all of us lose. We started today's service in our call to worship and in our prayer of confession with quotes from the beginning of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And so now I wish to read to you an extended passage, which includes some of what we have heard before. And in this reading, he's talking about just versus unjust laws. take in this letter with the same reverence that we treat Paul's letter to the Philippians. And now I quote, "I hope you are able to see the distinction I am trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is, in reality, expressing the highest respect for law. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians, who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws." Well, think about that. Dr. King, like Paul, like Jesus, we're trying to see through the law and point out what is just and what is unjust. Doing so upset those in power, and not just the elites, but the regular folk for whom the structure worked. What justice is that? Well, clearly, as they all ended up murdered, not much. As Paul reminds us in today's reading, Jesus could have lorded all power and authority given to him to bring about the kind of community he was hoping for. And yet he didn't. He knew that the path of power would not bring about the change of heart so needed for it to be successful. And instead, Jesus chose humility, literally becoming human. He chose a path, a mortal path, that led to death. And when tempted, Jesus was given the opportunity to rule over all the kingdoms of the world. But he rejected that path too, the path of power, the path that whiteness tries to gain at all costs. And Jesus gave it all up, his body and his blood, his very last breath. And that, my friends, is why Jesus cannot be white. And that is why we all can win. And thank God for that. Amen.
Amen.